Well, it's the first week of Advent, and in it there's this amazing theme in Advent of waiting for Jesus coming, waiting for the light of the world to come into this dark world of ours, but also looking to the end of time when the King will return. There's a great theme of judgment in Advent as well, and that's so good when we're looking at our final sermon in our series on calling, on looking at who we are called to be in Jesus. And as I was saying right at the beginning of this particular series on David, I was saying that, we're called to be a church of demonstration. We're called to demonstrate God's love and his great power, and to turn our backs on that sort of negotiation with the world that so many of us can fall into. We're called to live empowered lives. And if we're genuinely seeking to live lives that are full of God's power and lives that are full of his love, our Father, in all his goodness, he will so often lead us the way of obscurity. That's exactly what he does to David. We find David at the moment in obscurity. He's got a band of men who were sort of the waifs and strays of society. He's trained them up to be a band of fighting force, but really he couldn't be further from the kingship that he was prophesied by Samuel. And not only that, he's actually really drifted away from his relationship with God. The way I like to read this text is, if you look at 1 Samuel 27, what you find is that David is just exhausted by constantly being harried by Saul. And, we heard Shah preach last week about that, didn't we? And he's just tired out of being harried by Saul in his own land. So it says he's tired in his heart. So he says to his heart, I can't do this anymore. And he goes off to Gath and talks to the king there called Achish. And it leads him into a really enormous compromise. And in order to maintain face, he ends up doing these awful raids on the Amalekites and other tribal groups where he just kills everyone. And then he tells the king of Achish he's been raiding in Judah. Now, I'm sure this was not God's will for Saul's life. Is this us in some way? Have we drifted away from our first love for God, from that love we had when we first came to faith, maybe first came to church for the first time and discovered just how good God is, and it made us excited in our hearts? Or are we a bit like David, facing a perfect storm of just the results of years of drifting? David here, he's really reaping the whirlwind, isn't he? He's sown his own way. He's chosen to go his own way, and he's reaping the whirlwind. And the great temptation when we're faced with these crises in life, when we drift away from the Lord, the great temptation is to be defined by the circumstances around us. We might even find ourselves railing against God, making him totally powerless in our lives. What does David do in this incredibly difficult circumstance where his house is being burnt down, his wives and children are being kidnapped, and the people around him want to kill him? What does he do in the face of such enormous pressure? Well, it's written in one little verse in this text, and it's just a beautiful verse. It says, David strengthened himself in the Lord. I had a period of fasting this year, and out of that, I just had a very strong sense of God saying to me, it's a word from Song of Songs, wear me like a seal on your heart, like a seal on your arm. Choose me in your heart and choose to do what I do. And what we find here is that David, perhaps he quiets himself, strengthening himself in the Lord. He quiets himself before the Lord. That's an incredible thing, isn't it, to do in the circumstances. But you've got to remember that this man was the same man who wrote, Lord, you have searched me and you know me. You know when I sit and when I rise. You perceive my thoughts from afar. Before a word is on my tongue, you know it completely, O Lord. David knew how to be still in the presence of the Lord and almost just remember his presence and get himself into that place of just sensing the presence of the Lord. What an incredible time to do it. But it is a place of immense power. You know, if we're able to still ourselves in the face of the storm, we're standing in a long line of biblical characters that really starts with Moses. You know, that the greatest of all miracles in the Old Testament. Moses is standing before the Red Sea and God says, you only need to be still. You only need to be still. Perhaps as he's stilling himself, as he's sensing God's presence once more in his life, he begins to remember the God he worships. You know, the Israelites, they would always look back on the greatest stories. Perhaps he began to remember that the God who was with him, because he knew he was there with him, was the same God who parted the Red Sea. Perhaps he begins to remember that great conflict with Goliath, when he as a small boy faced off the trained giant from Gath. Perhaps he begins to remember the promises that are spoken over his life by the prophet Samuel. As he stills himself in the Lord's presence, he begins to remember the God he worships. And then he does the second thing, which is he's forgotten to go God's way, but this time he chooses it. You know, he gets Abiathar the priest, he gets the ephod, and he says, Lord, is it right that we go and find our women and our wives and our children? What an amazing question to ask God. You know, most of us would probably rush ahead and start looking for them, but David says, no, I want to find out if God is going to go with us. And of course, that's exactly what God has been waiting for since 1 Samuel 27. And he says, yes, of course, I'm going to go with you. You go for it. And do you know what? I think it's that second bit, that seeking the Lord in what we do, that we so often get wrong. I'm sure, I sort of sense that that's the stumbling block for many of us. And, you know, the Lord would say to us who have drifted away from him, he would say, look at me. Remember your first love for me. Don't forget my son who died for you, who gave everything for you. There's this great photograph, I've talked about it before. It's taken from the film set of The Passion of the Christ, and it has Jesus, the actor, playing Jesus just after the flogging scene, and there's fake blood all over him. It looks appalling. It looks like a horror scene. He's sitting on one of those casting chairs, and next to him is one of the directors. He's just talking through the next scene, and the caption says, try telling him about your hard day. Now, I know we can get that wrong. It's really important we share all our problems with Jesus. He wants to hear our problems. But do you know what? We can get so stuck. You know, what does David do? What does David do in this situation? He stills himself and he seeks God's way. And you know, it's a big way, isn't it? So often we get so stuck in our very small problems in our very small lives, but we forget that God has a problem. And then God's problem was that the king that sat on the throne had just forgotten who he was and who God was. And the problem today for God is that the church really has forgotten who we are. We as the church, we've forgotten who we are, and we've forgotten who God is. You know, we are called to be the glory of God on earth. We're called to be his great gift to the world around us. But so often we get stuck in apathy and powerlessness. And we're like a rabbit in the headlight of our problems, aren't we? We forget that we're called to be a great demonstration of God's power and of his love. We're called to look like the Church of Acts. We're called to live empowered lives. And do you know, for us who have drifted so far, the world could look at our church, couldn't they? And this isn't just the church in Liphook, this is the church in the West probably. And, the big question is, do they see the goodness of God? Do they see the power of God? Do they see the love of God when they look at us? Because that is our incredibly high calling. It's Advent, isn't it? And as a church, we're called to be the light of the world and the power of God on this earth. And if you, like David, have found yourself drifting from the great call that God has over your life, or you even feel like a bit overwhelmed by the problems that you face today, remember this Advent to be still. Make a commitment, make it a priority to be still before your Father in heaven, to still yourself, to let go of all the rational analysis or all the problems that sort of circle around our heads, and just to be still and seek his way, seek his desire, seek his call for your life afresh. God bless you today, and remember that the light of the world not only walks beside you this Advent, but he also lives in your hearts. Amen.